What do MTN, Tiger Brands and Standard Bank subsidiary Stanbic IBTC all have in common? It's a quiz question. This is the Moneymakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield, and in case you haven't figured out the answer to my question, my guest, Martyn Davies, who's Managing Director of Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte-Frontier Advisory, and Temitope Oshikoya, the Chief Executive of Nextnomics in Nigeria, will supply you with that answer. We'll go to Nigeria in a minute, but Martyn Davies, trouble at mill, as they say from the part of the world that you originate from in the north of England, for South African companies doing business in Nigeria.
It looks that way, as the tide has clearly turned. I think there's been a sort of a rising temperature in a bad way of relations between South Africa and Nigeria over years.
Business relationships, political relationships.
Politics feeding into business. I think when it was very sort of evident. I think, Bruce, you may have been there a couple of years ago, World Economic Forum in Cape Town, how the Nigerians were seeing us, how they were received about the South African side, and it was kind of reciprocated in a not a very positive way, I felt, in Abuja in 2014 when we were up there for the forum again. So it's there's clearly I think there's frictions there, but again I think the major story, however, is that regulatory bodies in Nigeria are becoming far more assertive, some would say even predatory. And I'm being told that certain regulators have financial targets even, considering the financial situation that Nigeria is in.
Let's get the view from Nigeria. Timitope Oshikoya, the Chief Executive of Nextnomics in Nigeria. Timitope, do you see predatory regulators? What's your perspective on what is happening to the likes of Tiger Brands, MTN and Standard Bank?
Well, I think we should look at this from 4 different stakeholders. First is the regulatory and the government. Second is the companies themselves. Third are the consumers and possibly investors. In the case of the regulatory agencies, I think the current government is trying to send clear signals that they are going to be very aggressive with respect to institutional reforms and ensuring institutional effectiveness. And that means that regulatory power has to be used judiciously and efficiently. But at the same time, it's also important that companies' interests are also not damaged until full investigation are made. I think it's better not to probably go to the press and announce things prematurely, especially for a bank like Stanbic. Already we've seen that the share of Stanbic has declined by about 17% in the last 3 trading days. And for MTN, it's almost about $5 billion is the amount that is involved. Again, I think if you look at the fact that Nigeria has lost significantly foreign portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment has declined to about $2 billion from the highest of about $8 billion in 2011 or so. I think we want to focus more on engaging and attracting foreign direct investment, such as that of the MTN and the Tiger and other companies, including South African companies. But the interests of government and the interests of the consumers also need to be protected. And at the same time, we need to ensure that the shareholders and investors are not spooked by the effort of the regulatory agencies.
Okay, we'll go back to Martyn Davies in a moment. Your response to that, Martyn?
Well, again, I think it's, again, as I said, again, the tide has turned. The fiscal pressures, the fiscal tightening in Nigeria is such that I think there's, I believe there's instructions politically, or very good politics here, certainly, but always results in bad economics and bad for business. But I think Nigeria, and just picking up what was said, this is a terrible time. Nigeria should, I think, should be treading rather lightly, I would argue, in terms of its major investors in the country.
But Nigeria is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, because
yes, but
it's accused of being business unfriendly when it's tough. It's accused of not being sufficiently rigorous in its regulatory regimes when it's not.
Well, it's from one, Bruce, perhaps it's from one extreme to the other. This is almost like a VW moment, but in the case of Nigeria, very similar. But we've been waiting since May for a cabinet to be established. Has not been established as yet. Very uncertain business environment. This has just now been compounded Davies' actions against MTN, Standard Bank, and also 2 other, First Bank and UB Bank in Nigeria as well. So it's not creating at all, stating the obvious, a favourable perception for existing investors, never mind new investors, particularly the difficult times that Nigeria is currently facing.
Timitope, is, in your perspective, Nigeria just standing up for itself, or is it being, as Martyn Davies put it earlier, predatory in its regulation?
I wouldn't say that the government is trying to be predatory in its regulation. Definitely, the laws are on the book, but they need to be enforced. The key thing is to make sure that they're enforced carefully, and this government is sending out clear signal that it is no longer business as usual, whereby you have companies not adhering to rules, whether they are domestic companies or foreign companies. And it's sending clear signal that it's going to embark on serious institutional reforms. It's been going, if you look at what is going on within the NNPC is a Nigerian company. Yet the government is trying to make sure that it is doing business as it should. And I think what they're trying to do is to also ensure that in the telecom industry, that regulations that are on the book are also enforced. For example, we know that the registration of mobile owners also is a security issue, so which the government will be interested in. But at the same time, I think the charges might be excessive, but I believe that if there will be dialogue between the government and MTN, and I believe this issue can be resolved amicably between the two parties.
Is there any suggestion, Timitope, that there is a targeting of specific companies, or is there a universal clampdown on lax business practices across the Nigerian economy?
I believe it's more of the latter. There is a universal clampdown on business practices. I just mentioned NNPC, where they're carrying out stringent and aggressive reforms. Last week, 2 banks were fined for not complying with the Treasury single account, and these banks are Nigerian banks. And so it's not. We should not see it as an isolated event. In the case of MTN, the charges might be $5 billion, might be a lot. So I think there is need for a dialogue between the government and MTN. In the case of the case of Stanbic IBTC, again, I think the 2 parties can resolve this matter. But it is not an isolated case or isolated cases. Nigerian firms have been also, the regulatory authorities are going after Nigerian firms as well, not just foreign companies. So I think that's the way we should look at it.
Martyn Davies, if it's a blanket clamping down on lax business practices, then longer term it's a good thing. It's perhaps just been done in a slightly ham-fisted fashion.
I don't think, as was said, it should not. The fines should not be onerous. Of course, law must always be respected. Nigeria, we all know, needs a far more certain business environment.
And perhaps this is what this is intended to achieve?
Arguably, yes, but $5.2 billion, I mean, by all counts, seems somewhat excessive by any measure.
It's practically the value of the business in Nigeria.
Well, correct. At the same time, it will be, this time next year, it'll be maybe 20% less because of currency depreciation. But regardless, and I hope this is solved in an amicable fashion as suggested, because clearly this is excessive.
I mean, for South African companies either doing business or intending to do business in Nigeria, is this a warning signal, or is it just part of the furniture?
Something I often say is that, traditionally capital has chased resources in Africa. Capital has followed resources. In Nigeria's case, purely because of population, capital, and this sort of underpins the Africa Rising narrative of the last decade and a half or so, capital has chased demographics. And that was Nigeria's arguably only comparative economic advantage, a sizable population. No one's talking about Whitey Passon. I don't think he's ever spoken about Benin being a priority market, or Gabon or Togo, etc. But Nigeria is, its demographics. Ultimately, and this is Nigeria's, as you said earlier, being a rock on a rock or a rock in a hard place. is how does Nigeria create those necessary institutions and an environment of business certainty, legal certainty, where capital be attracted to governance, and that's ultimately what we want here.
Let's wrap up with Timitope then. So is this a governance improvement in your view then, Timitope?
It is indeed. If you look at Nigeria's governance index on the World Bank, is extremely very low. If you look at doing business, the index, Nigeria is also very poor. If you look at the competitiveness index, Nigeria is also very poor. And part of it is institutional constraints. And this is what this government is going after, that it is going to ensure institutional reforms, is going to ensure institutional effectiveness, which have been affecting transaction costs for businesses. So if the government is able to level the playing field, if it's able to ensure that corruption, bribery is no longer what people should expect in Nigeria, if it's able to raise the stake, making sure that everybody knows that the laws are there and that they are going to be enforced, then the transaction costs will come down overall. So I think overall this is good for governance, it's good for reforms, and it's good for institutional effectiveness in Nigeria. And specifically in terms of those companies that were mentioned, I believe that there can be compromise, there can be dialogue to resolve the issues.
Temitope, thank you very much for us in Nigeria. Martyn Davies, the final wrap up with you. There are 100 ways of doing things. The Nigerians have gone in feet first onto this one. They may regret it in the short term. Will it have the desired long-term consequences? I
think Nigeria has to put in place, and just echoing what was said, the necessary structures of fundamentals, the process of law, to create a more certain business environment. Up until now, there's been this, especially from SA Inc.'s perspective, where you started off, Bruce, is that there's been this obsession with gaining traction in Nigeria, often at the expense, arguably, of other African economies. I think if you're looking at Nigeria, Angola, Kenya, South Africa, that's 80% of sub-Saharan African GDP, 4 countries. Nigeria on the back burner, Angola back burner because of low commodity prices. This provides enormous opportunity for regions like East Africa, think Kenya, think Ethiopia arguably, to really get their governance house in order, ease of business, more attractive to capital, and perhaps arguably, very arguably, maybe prematurely, displace Nigeria, which has been, should we say, the sexiest destination for capital in the region in recent years.
It's high stakes games indeed. Dr. Martyn Davies, Managing Director of Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte-Frontier Advisory, and Temitope Oshikoya, who's Chief Executive of Nextnomics in Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us this evening, and thank you for watching. More Moneymakers tomorrow. Till then, good night for now. Bye-bye.